I've always loved camping. It's the kind of getaway that disconnects you from the chaos of the city, you know? My friend Mike and I always planned little weekend adventures, and back in early June 2022, we decided to explore some trails in Oklahoma. I had just quit a stressful job, and Mike was on an extended break from work, so it seemed like the perfect time to breathe in some fresh air and catch up. The plan was simple: 2 days in the woods, one tent, a few beers, and of course, plenty of stories to tell later. We grabbed an old, worn-out map of lesser-known trails, trusting our compass and instincts, which, looking back, may not have been as sharp as we thought. We arrived in the early afternoon. The forest was dense, almost suffocating, with tall trees that seemed to swallow you whole when you looked up. After hours of hiking, we found a spot that looked perfect for setting up camp. It was near a small creek, but what really caught our attention was an old barn, the kind you only see in horror movies or read about in online forums like this one. It sat there, in the middle of nowhere, as if time had forgotten it. The boards were rotting, the paint was peeling, and the windows. They looked like blind eyes staring at us. Mike, as always, thought it was incredible. "Imagine the photos we could take here," he said. I laughed, but there was this strange feeling in the pit of my stomach. It was like the place didn't want us there. As the sun began to set, we decided to explore the barn. The inside was filled with things that looked like they'd been abandoned for decades: rusty tools, unmarked wooden crates, and even an old tractor covered in moss that seemed almost alive. Mike pointed out a pile of bones in the corner, probably from some animal. "Think they still use this place for hunting?" he asked. I just shrugged, but the atmosphere was too strange for logic. Even the sound inside the barn was weird, like the old wood-absorbed noise making everything feel muffled. After a while, we headed back to our tent to make something to eat before it got too dark. Still, that uneasy feeling lingered. Night fell fast, and with it came an oppressive silence. No wind, no animal sounds, just the crackling of the fire we built beside the tent. It was odd. On other trails you'd hear crickets or nocturnal birds, but here everything felt unnervingly still. We chatted about random things to distract ourselves, but the mood shifted when we heard footsteps. It was hard to tell how many, but they were coming from the direction of the barn. Mike grabbed the flashlight while I froze, trying to listen more carefully. "Probably a deer or something," he said, but his tone didn't convince even himself. When he pointed the beam of light toward the sound, what we saw wasn't a deer. 3 men emerged from between the trees, illuminated by Mike's flashlight. They were armed, holding rifles like they were second nature. They didn't look like normal hunters. Their clothes were worn and dirty, and one of them wore a wide-brimmed hat that cast a shadow over half his face. The oldest one spoke first, his voice low and dry. "You're on private property. You shouldn't be here." Mike tried to respond but stammered nervously. I couldn't take my eyes off the rifle he was holding, pointed casually at the ground but ready to be aimed at us in a heartbeat. "We didn't know, sir. We're just camping. We'll leave right now," I said, trying to stay calm. "It's not that simple," another man said, younger, with eyes that seemed to glow in the dark. He stepped forward and the tension thickened. Mike stepped back, nearly tripping over the collapsed tent. They started circling us like predators while we stood there, frozen. The oldest one knelt down and prodded the fire with the tip of his rifle, extinguishing it with a quick motion. "You thought you could come here, poke around our things, and leave like nothing happened?" His tone grew more menacing with each word, and that's when it hit me. They knew we had gone inside the barn. We didn't think twice. We grabbed our things as fast as we could, stuffing everything into our backpacks without any care. Mike was shaking so much he dropped his canteen, but I whispered for him to leave it. It wasn't worth the risk. The men stood there, watching us, unmoving, as we backed away. The silence was unbearable, broken only by the hurried crunch of our footsteps on dried leaves. When we were far enough that their flashlights disappeared into the trees, Mike finally spoke, almost breathless. "What the hell was that? They didn't seem normal." I nodded, but I didn't want to answer. At that moment, my only concern was getting to the car. The trail that had seemed so straightforward earlier now felt like a labyrinth. The darkness felt heavier, and the trees around us cast twisted shadows under the weak beams of our flashlights. We walked in silence for a while, but then I started to notice something strange. Footsteps. Not ours. It was like someone was following us, keeping a calculated distance. I stopped abruptly, signaling Mike to stay quiet. He noticed it too because his flashlight started shaking in his hand. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. I nodded, feeling the air grow colder with every passing second. We turned to look, but there was nothing, just the oppressive darkness. Yet the sound persisted, surrounding us, like the forest itself was closing in. We kept walking, picking up the pace, trying to ignore the feeling that someone, or something, was trailing us. Our flashlights lit up something ahead, and for a moment I thought it was a post or some kind of abandoned structure. But it wasn't. It was a large sign, planted firmly in the ground, with faded letters that read, "Private property. No trespassing. Trespassers will be prosecuted." Beneath the sign, scrawled in what looked like red paint, or blood, was a handwritten warning, "Do not look back." Mike read it out loud, and as he did, we heard a loud snap from the trees behind us, followed by heavy, quick footsteps. "Run!" I shouted, and we bolted, not daring to look back, the sound of whatever was chasing us growing closer. We ran until our legs burned, and the footsteps behind us seemed to grow louder with every stride. My mind was in full panic, but deep down, I knew that if I turned around I might never make it out. Mike stumbled over a root and hit the ground hard. "Get up!" I yelled, grabbing him by the arm and pulling him up with all the strength I had. He was crying, mumbling something about them being close, but I forced him to keep moving. Finally, we saw a light in the distance, faint and flickering, but enough to give us a shred of hope. When we reached the source of the light, we realized it was coming from a small wooden cabin, almost as old as the barn we'd seen earlier. The door was slightly ajar, and inside was a lantern hanging from the ceiling, swaying gently as if someone had just left. "We have to go in," Mike said, desperate. I hesitated but knew we had no choice. We shut the door behind us and turned off the lantern, trying not to make a sound. The cabin was small and nearly empty, with a table covered in knife marks and an old chair in the corner. Outside we heard footsteps circling the cabin, slow and deliberate. I held my breath, praying that whatever was out there would leave. The footsteps were methodical, almost like whoever, or whatever it was, wanted us to know they were there. Mike clung to my arm so tightly I thought he might cut off my circulation. I stared at the door, waiting for it to burst open, but the steps stopped. The silence that followed was suffocating, heavier than before. Then came a soft sound, a slow tapping on the cabin walls, coming from all sides at once. Mike started whispering a prayer, something incoherent, while I tried to think of a way out. That's when I noticed something strange. On the table near the door was an old crank radio, turned on but completely silent. The dim light on the panel flickered, like it was picking up some kind of signal. Suddenly, a voice crackled through the static, low and distorted. "You still have time. Leave now." I froze, unsure if it was a warning or a trap. Before I could react, the cabin door shook violently, as if someone had slammed into it with all their strength. The door looked like it was about to give in, and my whole body went into overdrive. Mike was in the corner, frozen in terror, staring at the door like it was about to explode. The radio crackled again, but this time the voice was clearer. "Run out the back, now!" I didn't question it. I grabbed Mike by the arm and we looked for an escape. There was a small window in the back of the cabin, barely big enough for us to squeeze through, but it would have to do. With some effort, we pushed the rotting wood open and climbed out, landing hard on the damp, leaf-covered ground. Without looking back, we started running again. It didn't matter where we were headed. All that mattered was putting as much distance as possible between us and that place. The trees seemed to close in tighter, their branches clawing at us as we pushed through. But then, just as the first light of dawn began to break on the horizon, we stumbled onto a dirt road. Parked on the side was an old pickup truck, and standing next to it was a man in a hunting vest. He looked at us, confused, as we staggered toward him, covered in dirt and scratches. "What happened to you?" he asked, but I couldn't find the words to respond. I just collapsed on the ground, exhausted. As we caught our breath by the road, the man kept watching us, clearly unsettled by our appearance and panic. Mike finally managed to speak. There was someone in the woods. They were chasing us." The man frowned but didn't look surprised. He glanced toward the trees and spat on the ground before saying, "Those woods are trouble. You're lucky you made it out alive." The way he said it wasn't out of curiosity or concern. It was like he knew exactly what we were talking about. Before we could ask more, he pointed to his truck and said, "Get in. I'll take you to the nearest station." The drive was silent. All Mike and I wanted was to get as far away from that forest as possible. When we finally reached the station, we explained everything to the officer who attended us. He listened carefully, but his expression was distant. When we finished, he just shook his head and said, "You're not the first, and I doubt you'll be the last." He went on to explain that the area had a dark history involving violent landowners and disappearances that were never solved. "If I were you," he said, "I'd forget about this place and move on." That's exactly what we tried to do. To this day, whenever I hear footsteps behind me on an empty street or faint laughter in the middle of the night, I feel that same chill I felt in that forest. I never truly understood what happened out there or who those people were, but one thing is certain. I'll never go camping in Oklahoma again. I've always been passionate about solo camping. Maybe it sounds a little strange, but I've always felt like nothing compares to being out in the middle of nowhere, surrounded only by nature and complete silence. Last year, at the end of September, I took some time off work and decided to explore a more isolated part of the forest in Washington state. It was a place I'd never been to before, but a friend of mine, Mike, had recommended it. He described the area as perfect for anyone looking to disconnect from the world. At the time, my life was a mess. A recent breakup, stress at work. I thought a few days away from everything would be exactly what I needed. I arrived there on a cold, cloudy afternoon. The place was exactly as Mike had described, dense, quiet, and almost surreal in its beauty. I found a small clearing near a creek and decided to pitch my tent there. I spent the rest of the day exploring the area, gathering firewood, and getting familiar with the surroundings. Everything seemed peaceful. Until that night. I can't say for sure what woke me up, but I remember feeling a strange chill as soon as I opened my eyes. Outside, the forest was completely dark, and the sound of the creek felt farther away than before. When I finally mustered the courage to grab my flashlight and unzip the tent, I saw something that sent a shiver down my spine. Footprints circling my tent. They weren't mine. Someone had walked around my tent while I was sleeping. I'm not the type to panic easily, but in that moment it felt like my heart was going to leap out of my chest. The footprints were fresh, as if they'd been made just a short while ago, and they looked like they came from heavy boots. Nothing like the ones I was wearing. I took a deep breath and tried to think rationally. Maybe it was a hunter or another camper who'd wandered by without meaning any harm. But why would someone walk in circles around my tent in the middle of the night? It didn't make sense. I stayed awake for the rest of the night, clutching a pocket knife I always bring with me when camping. Every little sound, The rustle of leaves, the babbling creek, felt amplified. Nothing else happened that night, but the idea that I wasn't alone out there wouldn't leave my mind. The next morning I decided to explore the area more carefully. I wanted to understand if those footprints led somewhere specific. Maybe it was just curiosity or a need to feel safe, but I started following the trail. The footprints disappeared near the creek, but as I walked along the bank, something caught my eye. About 20 yards ahead, I saw a man crouching, digging in the ground as if he were burying something. He was wearing a thick hunting jacket and seemed nervous, constantly glancing over his shoulder. I ducked down immediately, trying not to make any noise. My heart was racing, and every instinct in me was screaming to get out of there, but I couldn't stop watching. He was pushing something large and heavy, wrapped in a black bag, into a hole. I stayed frozen for a few minutes, trying to decide what to do. Part of me wanted to turn and run back to my campsite, but what if he saw me? So I did my best to back away quietly, keeping my eyes on him the whole time. When I thought I was far enough, I ran back to my tent as fast as I could. My mind was a mess. I tried to convince myself it could have been harmless. Maybe he was just burying trash or something he didn't want to carry home. But I couldn't shake the image of how nervous he looked, constantly checking his surroundings. It didn't feel right. I spent the rest of the day near my campsite, too afraid to wander far. I didn't want to risk running into that man again. When night fell, I started to feel even more vulnerable. Every little sound felt like it was coming from something, or someone, getting closer. Around midnight, I heard a noise that froze me in place. Footsteps. It wasn't an animal. It was human footsteps, slow and deliberate, circling my tent. Each time they came around, the sound grew louder, closer. Suddenly, something hit the side of the tent, like a branch or a rock. I was paralyzed. Whoever it was, they were trying to scare me. After what felt like an eternity, the noise stopped, but I knew someone was still out there. I didn't sleep a second that night. I sat there clutching my knife, ears straining for any sound. When the first light of dawn finally broke through the trees, I packed up everything as quickly as I could. I had to get out of there. As I took down the tent, something on the ground caught my attention. A broken branch, placed right in front of the tent's entrance. It hadn't been there before. It felt deliberate, like a warning. My mind was racing, and as much as I wanted to believe I was imagining things, every detail pointed to the opposite. On the hike back to the main trail, the feeling of being watched never left me. I'd stop occasionally and glance behind me, but there was no one there. Still, the forest felt heavier, darker, like it was closing in around me. That's when I saw him, about 50 yards away between the trees. It was the same man. He was standing there, partially hidden behind a trunk, watching me. He didn't move closer, but the look in his eyes sent a chill through me. It wasn't just curiosity or suspicion. It was cold, calculated, like he was deciding what to do with me. I didn't wait to find out. I picked up my pace, almost running, and focused on reaching the trail. When I finally got to my car, it felt like a massive weight had been lifted off my shoulders. I threw my backpack in the back seat, jumped in, and locked the doors. I scanned the area one last time, expecting him to appear, but there was no one there. I started the engine and drove off as fast as I could without looking back. On the way home, I couldn't stop checking the rearview mirror, convinced he might somehow be following me. It was irrational, but the feeling of being followed stayed with me. When I got back to town, I stopped at a coffee shop to try to calm down before going home. I sat by the window sipping a black coffee and watching people come and go. Every time someone walked in, my heart skipped a beat, but thankfully, he never showed up. Over the next few days, I tried to return to normal life, but something in me had changed. I started having recurring nightmares where I was trapped in that forest, unable to escape, with him watching me from the shadows. I couldn't stop thinking about what I'd seen in that black bag. Whether it was paranoia or instinct, I eventually called the local police to report what I'd witnessed. I didn't give them my name, just described the location and what I saw. They said they'd send someone to investigate, but I never heard anything about it again. To this day, I still wonder if it was something dangerous or if I'd misinterpreted everything. What scares me most, though, is thinking about what could have happened if I'd stayed in that forest one more night. I've always been the kind of person who preferred a good book or a board game over any outdoor adventure. But in the summer of 2018, my friends convinced me to step out of my comfort zone and join them on a hiking trip in Montana. At the time, I was recovering from a tough breakup and thought a few days disconnected from everything might be exactly what I needed. Our group was made up of 5 people: me, Jake, the self-proclaimed expedition leader, Sarah, who never stopped taking pictures, Ben, always telling scary stories to keep us entertained, and Emily, my best friend, who had the uncanny ability to turn any situation into a joke. The plan was simple: follow a marked trail, camp out for 2 nights, and then head back home. The first day went smoothly with breathtaking views, but things started to change when we stumbled upon that strange place. It was around 3 in the afternoon when we came across the cabin. It was partially hidden by tall trees, with rotting boards and broken windows that looked like empty eyes staring at us. But the most attention-grabbing thing was the message spray-painted on the door: "Keep out, do not stay after dark." The warning seemed recent, but the peeling paint on the walls and the overgrown grass around it made it clear that no one had lived there for years. Ben, of course, found it hilarious. He suggested we go inside to explore, but Jake shut the idea down, saying we were already behind schedule and needed to find a spot to set up camp. I can't explain it, but as soon as I saw the cabin, I felt this strange tightness in my chest. It was like the place emitted a heavy, oppressive energy that clung to my skin. Still, we moved on, though I noticed Sarah sneaking a few photos before we left. After walking for about another 30 minutes, we found a small clearing by a stream and decided to set up camp there. The spot seemed perfect: fresh water, enough room for the tents, and a spectacular view of the sunset over the mountains. As we pitched our tents, Ben kept talking about the cabin. He speculated that the warning on the door was probably left by a hunter trying to keep people away, but Emily, maybe just to stir things up, said it looked like something straight out of a horror movie. I tried to tune out the conversation, but that tightness in my chest wouldn't go away. Sarah, on the other hand, was as excited as ever. She showed us the photos she'd taken, including some of the cabin. When she zoomed in on one of the images, I noticed something strange: a shadow in the corner of the broken window, as if someone had been inside watching us. She laughed it off, saying it was probably just a trick of the light, but I couldn't shake it from my mind. As the sun began to set, the clearing was gradually enveloped in deeper shadows. The sound of the stream, which had been soothing earlier, now seemed too loud, drowning out any other noises from the forest. Sitting around the campfire, we talked about trivial things, trying to ignore the growing unease. That's when we first heard it: a whisper. It was so faint that I thought I was imagining it at first. But when I looked at Sarah, I could tell she'd heard it too. "Did you guys hear that?" she asked, her usually cheerful voice hesitant. Jake tried to brush it off, saying it was probably the wind, but the night was eerily still, with no breeze at all. We tried to ignore it and keep talking, but as the hours passed, the whispers returned, louder and clearer this time. They sounded like words, but in a language none of us recognized. Ben joked that it was some kind of ancient curse, but no one laughed. By then, the fear was beginning to creep in. Shortly after midnight, things took a turn for the worse. The shadows in the trees seemed to move in ways that didn't make sense. I blinked several times, trying to convince myself it was just the flickering light from the campfire. but something about it felt wrong. Emily, who was always the skeptical one, suddenly stood up and pointed to the edge of the clearing. "There's someone out there," she whispered. When we all looked, we didn't see anything, but the feeling of being watched was almost unbearable, like a weight pressing down on us. We decided to shine our flashlights into the woods, even though we were all terrified. As the beams of light swept through the darkness, we caught a brief glimpse of a figure among the trees. It was tall and thin, moving too fast to be human. Before anyone could react, it disappeared, as if it had never been there. After that, there was no pretending everything was okay. Jake tried to keep us calm, suggesting we get inside our tents and wait until sunrise, but no one wanted to be alone. We all squeezed into the biggest tent, trying to make as little noise as possible. The silence outside was almost unbearable, like the entire forest was holding its breath, waiting. And then the whispers started again, this time much closer. They seemed to come from all directions, blending with the sound of the stream and the rustling leaves. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. Every minute felt like an eternity, and any attempt to speak was met with desperate looks to stay quiet. It felt like any sound we made would draw whatever was out there straight to us. Then something touched the tent. It was faint, almost like a hand sliding over the fabric, but enough to freeze us in place. No one dared to move. I held my breath, waiting for another sound. But what came next was worse. The tent's zipper began to move, slowly being pulled down. Jake reacted quickly, grabbing a camping knife and shouting at whoever, or whatever, was outside. The zipper stopped. Moments later, we heard heavy footsteps circling the tent, as if something or someone was walking around us. "We need to get out of here," I whispered, barely audible. Jake nodded, but the truth was, none of us had the courage to step outside. Whatever was out there knew exactly where we were, and it seemed to be toying with us. Ben broke the silence, pointing to the corner of the tent where the fabric was starting to give, as if something was pressing against it from the outside. "That's not human," he muttered, his voice trembling. We decided we couldn't wait any longer. Jake quickly came up with a plan. We'd run to the car parked about a mile away, leaving all our gear behind. As soon as we agreed, he unzipped the tent in one swift motion and yelled for us to run. What I saw outside still haunts me. Shadows, tall and twisted, moving in impossible ways, like the air around them was bending. I didn't look back. All that mattered was running as fast as I could. As we bolted down the trail, the whispers followed us, growing louder and more chaotic, like a dissonant chorus. Sarah tripped once, but Jake pulled her up before she could fall completely. I could feel whatever it was getting closer, like an oppressive presence breathing down my neck. When we finally saw the car, it was like a lifeline. Ben reached the keys first and unlocked the doors. We scrambled in, and Jake wasted no time starting the engine and speeding down the narrow road, nearly veering off the path. In the rear-view mirror, I caught one last glimpse of the shadows, standing at the edge of the road, watching us leave. They didn't follow, but it was clear they had done enough to terrify us. The next morning, when we finally reached a gas station, everything felt like a blur. No one wanted to talk about what had happened, and we drove home in silence. Sarah, however, couldn't bring herself to delete the photos on her phone. When she finally looked through them, we saw something that made our blood run cold. In several pictures of the cabin, the shadows were already there, lurking in the distance, even before we noticed their presence. We never went back to Montana, and we all agreed never to share this story until now. I still have nightmares about the whispers and those distorted figures. And every time I think about it, I wonder if we should have listened to the warning on the cabin door. After all, it wasn't there by chance. I've always been passionate about camping, especially in remote places far from the hustle and bustle of the city. In the summer of 2019, I decided to take a week off to explore western Wyoming. I found an isolated lake surrounded by tall pines and mountains in the background. It was perfect. The plan was to disconnect completely, just me and nature. At the time, I was working as a freelance photographer, and these getaways were my way of recharging. I arrived at the spot at dawn, set up my tent near the lake's edge, and spent the day fishing and taking pictures. It felt like something out of a postcard, and the peace made me forget the outside world. Early in the afternoon, as I was building a small fire to cook the fish I'd caught, I heard heavy footsteps coming from the trail behind me. I turned around and saw a man stepping out of the woods. He was skinny, wearing worn hiking clothes, and carrying a backpack that looked far too old for an experienced adventurer. He greeted me with an odd, forced smile and said he was lost. My gut told me to stay alert, but I kept my composure and offered him some food and water. He accepted but lingered nearby, looking at my campsite with an interest that made me uneasy. "Are you here alone?" he asked, and for some reason that question sent chills down my spine. I lied and said my group would be arriving later. Something in his expression made me think he knew I wasn't telling the truth. After he finished eating, I tried to guide him with some basic directions, pointing toward the main trail. He nodded but didn't seem in a hurry to leave. He kept asking increasingly personal questions. "Do you come to places like this often? How long are you staying here? And even, did you bring any weapons with you?" That last one made me deeply uncomfortable. Who asks something like that? I tried to act casual while tidying up the campsite, hoping he'd take the hint. Eventually, he said he'd leave but stood there for a moment as if expecting something. Finally, he grabbed his backpack, gave a short nod, and disappeared down the trail he came from. For a while, I managed to convince myself it was just a weird encounter. But as the sun started to set, the feeling that something was wrong didn't go away. I went to the lake to fetch some water and noticed fresh footprints near the shore. They weren't mine. They led in the opposite direction of where he'd supposedly gone. That made me tense, but I tried to rationalize it. Maybe he had taken a shortcut. Back at the campsite, I forced myself to stick to my routine, cooked my food and got into my tent early, but I couldn't relax. Every so often, I thought I heard footsteps, but the sound was so faint it could have been my imagination, or small animals. Only later, when the night had fully fallen, did the feeling of being watched become unbearable. Around 10 at night, while I was trying to sleep, I heard what sounded like a branch snapping near the tent. My heart raced. I sat up in silence, holding my breath, straining to hear more. For a moment everything went quiet, but then I heard another crack, closer this time. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent slowly, shining the light outside. At first I didn't see anything, just the dark forest and the lake reflecting the beam of my flashlight. But something felt off. The smell. It was like old sweat mixed with wet dirt, something that definitely wasn't there before. I swept the flashlight around, trying to convince myself there was nothing out there. That's when I saw it, just on the edge of the light, a figure standing still among the trees. I couldn't make out much detail, but it looked human, motionless, as if it was watching me. I tried speaking. "Who's there?" My voice came out steadier than I expected, but there was no reply. The silence was more terrifying than any words could have been. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, like a shadow among the trunks. Then my flashlight started flickering, blinking a few times before shutting off completely, leaving me in total darkness. I zipped the tent back up with trembling hands and grabbed my pocket knife, the only weapon I had. I thought about running to the car, but it was parked a good 15 minutes down the trail. Worse, I'd have to pass near the spot where I saw that figure. So I stayed inside, sitting with the knife in my hand, trying not to make a sound. Minutes felt like hours. Every little noise outside seemed amplified. The wind in the trees, dry leaves rustling, even the gentle sound of water on the lake. Then, suddenly, I heard footsteps. They weren't light, like those of a small animal. They were heavy, deliberate, and circling the tent. I closed my eyes for a moment, trying to stay calm, but my whole body was on high alert. The footsteps stopped right outside. And then a voice. Low, almost a whisper, but clear enough to make my blood run cold. "You shouldn't be here." That's when adrenaline took over. My first reaction was to yell something, anything, to try and scare it off. "Get out of here! I called the police, and they're on their way." Of course, it was a lie, but I needed to buy time. The response was absolute silence. No more footsteps, no more sounds. I unzipped a small part of the tent to peek outside, clutching the knife so hard my hands hurt. But there was no one there. The area around the tent was empty, like nothing had ever been there. The weird thing was that the footsteps hadn't faded. They had just stopped. I zipped the tent back up and sat there trying to make sense of what was happening. But the only thing I knew for sure was that I wasn't alone. A few moments later, I heard something even more disturbing. A whistle. It wasn't a normal whistle, the kind someone uses to get attention or pass the time. It was slow, melodic, but somehow wrong, like each note was deliberately chosen to unsettle. It came from somewhere to my left, near the lake. My whole body tensed up, but I knew I had to see what was going on. Taking a deep breath, I grabbed the spare flashlight from my bag and unzipped the tent carefully. The light illuminated the damp ground and the edge of the forest, but the whistling stopped the second I poked my head out. My eyes scanned the area, but everything seemed still. Then I saw something that made me freeze. On the closest tree, just a few feet away, there were scratch marks, as if someone had clawed at the trunk hard enough to tear off chunks of bark. My legs barely worked as I forced myself to step out of the tent. I needed to grab my things and get out of there as quickly as possible. I walked over to my backpack, which I'd hung on a branch, but when I grabbed it, I noticed something strange. It was open. I was absolutely sure I'd closed it before going into the tent. Rummaging through it quickly, I found that some items were out of place, and worse, my phone was missing. Panic began to creep in. I looked around, trying to decide what to do. My only option was to head for the car, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The silence around me was suffocating, as if the whole world had stopped breathing along with me. With the flashlight in hand, I started walking toward the trail that led to the car. Each step felt heavier than the last, as if the air itself was pressing down on me. The wet dirt beneath my boots made soft noises, and I tried to move as quietly as possible, but the forest seemed to amplify every sound I made. As I walked, I got the unmistakable feeling that something was following me, staying just out of sight to my right. It was like an invisible shadow moving between the trees. Every 10 steps, I stopped and shined the light around, but I never saw anything. Still, the feeling of being followed wouldn't go away. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. That's when I heard something that nearly made me collapse in fear. The same voice as before, but now closer, whispering, "You won't escape." It was so low it seemed to be spoken directly into my ear. But when I turned the flashlight in that direction, there was no one there. Tears began streaming down my face, but I kept moving, almost running along the trail. The whistling started again, this time ahead of me, as if whatever it was, whatever it wanted, was toying with me, controlling where I went. The flashlight shook in my hands, and the path to the car felt endless. I didn't even know if I was still going the right way, or just getting more lost in the forest. Finally, after what felt like hours, I saw the faint reflection of my car's headlights through the trees. Relief almost made me stumble, but I forced myself to keep moving, trying to stay as quiet as possible. When I reached the car, I unlocked the doors quickly and jumped into the driver's seat. I was about to turn the key in the ignition when something made me stop. In the rearview mirror, I saw movement. A shadow darted quickly behind the car, running from one side to the other. I froze, my hands trembling on the steering wheel. For a second, I considered just flooring it, but the thought of hitting that thing, whatever it was, terrified me even more. Suddenly, there was a loud bang on the passenger side window. I didn't have the courage to look, but the force of the hit shook the entire car. Heavy breathing started fogging up the glass, slow and rhythmic, as if whoever, or whatever it was watching me from outside. Gathering every ounce of courage I had, I turned my head slowly, only to find nothing there. The breathing stopped as abruptly as it started, but before I could process it, something slammed against the rear window. That was enough to snap me out of my trance. I turned the key in the ignition, and the car hesitated for what felt like an eternity before starting. The moment the engine roared to life, I slammed my foot on the gas and tore out of there, not caring what might be in my way. As I sped down the narrow trail, the car jolted violently over rocks and roots, but I didn't care. I just wanted to get as far away as possible. Even so, I couldn't help but glance in the rearview mirror. For a moment, I thought I'd escaped, but then I saw something that made my breath catch. At the edge of the headlight's glow, something was running after me. It wasn't human. The thing had a strange way of moving, like it was stumbling and lunging forward at the same time, impossibly fast. It was tall, thin, and its eyes, glowing like an animal's, stared straight at me. I didn't know if I was hallucinating or if it was really there, but I pressed the gas pedal even harder, risking losing control of the car. When I finally reached the main road, whatever it was stopped at the edge of the forest. I only caught its silhouette for a second before it vanished into the trees. My whole body was trembling, and tears streamed down my face uncontrollably. I kept driving for hours, not daring to stop until I reached a small town. There, I parked at a gas station, stumbled into the convenience store, and asked for help. The clerk looked at me like I was crazy, but let me use the phone to call a friend. I've never gone camping again after that day. To this day, I don't know what I encountered at that lake, but sometimes I still hear that whistle in my dreams. And whenever I do, I wake up with the same feeling of being watched. It's like that thing never really left. I've always been the kind of person who prefers staying behind the camera. Photography is my escape, you know. I work a regular office job during the day, but on free nights and weekends, I'm always out with my camera, exploring remote places in search of the perfect shot. That's how, in the summer of 2019, I decided to spend a night in an abandoned fire lookout tower I'd read about on some online forums. The plan was simple: capture a time-lapse of the stars, far away from light pollution. It wasn't my first time camping alone, but the isolation there felt different. The tower, located deep in the Appalachian forest, looked like something out of an old storybook, with its weathered structure and moss-covered windows. I arrived in the late afternoon, the sky painted orange as the sun dipped behind the mountains. The trail to the tower was longer than I'd expected, and by the time I got there, I was exhausted. The structure had a strange charm, almost melancholic, with creaking stairs that complained under each step as I climbed. At the top, the view was surreal. The silence was broken only by the rustling of the trees, and occasionally, the distant call of some animal. I set up my camera and started adjusting the settings for the time-lapse. Time flew as the sky darkened and the first stars appeared, but around 10 p.m. I noticed something strange. The wind carried a peculiar sound, like someone whispering my name, but that was impossible. At least, I thought it was. At first I tried to shrug it off, blaming it on the wind and my imagination. You trick yourself a lot when you're alone in the middle of nowhere. I kept working on the camera and took a break to eat a sandwich I'd packed. But as the minutes passed, the whispers became more frequent. They weren't constant, you know. They came in bursts, blending with the sound of the wind, and they always seemed far off, as if coming from the base of the tower. I tried to convince myself it was just paranoia, but I realized I was paying more attention to the dark forest than to the stars. The silence around me began to feel heavy, like something was slowly closing in. I stood up to check the windows just to make sure no animals or, I don't know, people were trying to climb up. There was nothing, just the endless darkness of the forest below. But as I looked closer, I saw something that made me freeze for a moment. A series of handprints, small and damp, smeared on the inside of the glass. They hadn't been there before. I was certain because one of the first things I did when I arrived was clean the windows to ensure a clear view for my photos. I stood there, staring at those prints, trying to make sense of them. They looked fresh, like someone had just pressed their hands against the glass. But I was alone. Or at least, I thought I was. My first instinct was to grab the flashlight sitting next to my backpack. The beam shook slightly in my hand. Nerves, I guess. But the tower was empty, just as it should have been. I even tried convincing myself that I could have made those marks without realizing it while setting up my gear. But that didn't add up. The prints were smaller than my hands, like they belonged to someone much younger, maybe a child. That thought made my chest tighten. I took a deep breath, trying to rationalize, and glanced outside, shining the flashlight down toward the forest below. Just the rustling trees. Nothing else. And then the sounds started again. This time they weren't distant whispers. They were footsteps. Short, light steps, like someone walking around the base of the tower. I walked over to the stairs, aiming the flashlight down, illuminating the steps descending into the darkness. "Hello? Is someone there?" My voice came out louder than I expected, almost comical as it echoed in the stillness. No answer. The footsteps stopped immediately, which in a way was scarier than hearing something back. It was as if whoever, or whatever, was out there now knew I was paying attention. I went back inside the tower, trying to stay calm. Every instinct I had told me to pack up and leave. But the idea of walking the trail in the pitch-black darkness, with the sound of those footsteps fresh in my memory, felt even worse. Plus, I'm stubborn, and part of me wanted to believe it was all just a big misunderstanding. Maybe it was an animal. Maybe my mind was playing tricks on me because I was tired. But the uneasiness grew with each passing minute. I sat down on the floor, my back against the wall, staring at the door, trying to ignore the feeling that I was being watched. Then I heard another noise, much closer this time. A soft tapping on the window behind me. It sounded like someone lightly scraping their nails against the glass, almost as if they were giving me a warning. I spun around quickly, flashlight in hand, but all I saw was the beam reflecting off the glass. It was as if the darkness outside was too thick for the light to cut through. I stood up slowly, approaching the window, and that's when I saw it. New handprints, but this time they weren't just small. They were much higher up than I could reach. It was as if something much larger than me was hanging on the outside, touching the glass. My whole body froze. It didn't make sense. The window was about 10 feet off the ground, and there was nothing outside for anyone to climb on. My stomach churned as I stepped back, keeping the flashlight fixed on the handprints. The thought that something that big could be out there, hidden in the darkness, was worse than anything I could have imagined. And the worst part? Everything was completely silent now, which somehow made it even creepier. My heart was pounding so loudly it felt like it echoed in the tower, and that's when I realized I wasn't alone anymore. There was something behind me. I didn't see it, but I felt it. The air got heavier, as if the entire space had shrunk around me. I turned so quickly I nearly tripped over my backpack, pointing the flashlight toward the opposite corner of the room. For a split second, I swear I saw movement, like a shadow darting into the darkest part of the tower where the light couldn't reach. I wanted to run, I wanted to scream, but nothing came out. I only managed to move when a deep sound, like deliberate scratching, echoed through the wooden floor below me. Without thinking, I grabbed my backpack and bolted for the stairs, refusing to look back. Climbing down those stairs felt like it took forever. The flashlight trembled in my hand, lighting only a few steps ahead as I focused on staying steady. With every step, the sound of scratching seemed to follow me, coming from above, as though something was watching me and moving slowly. I couldn't bring myself to look up. I was too afraid of confirming what my mind was already imagining. When I finally reached the bottom and stepped onto the forest floor, the silence outside was deafening. Even the wind had stopped. The only sound I could hear was my own ragged breathing. Without hesitating, I started walking quickly along the trail I had hiked earlier in the day. The forest felt different at night, like the trees had closed in, making the path narrower. No matter how hard I tried to focus on the trail ahead, I couldn't shake the feeling of being followed. The worst part came when I glanced back, just out of reflex, and saw something that made my blood run cold. At the top of the tower, a figure was clinging to the outside, its body twisted in ways that didn't look human. I couldn't make out the face or details, but its arms were far too long, and its head tilted at an impossible angle. I froze for a second before a loud crack from the trail ahead snapped me out of it. That sound was all it took to get me moving again. I didn't wait to see what had caused it. I started running down the trail, ignoring the branches that scraped my face and the noises that now seemed to come from every direction. It was like something, or many things, were moving with me, hidden in the trees. For a brief moment, I thought I heard muffled laughter, but it could have just been my imagination. The flashlight began to flicker, its beam cutting in and out, which only made everything worse. With each flicker, the shadows seemed to shift, creeping closer. When I finally saw my car parked at the trailhead, I felt a brief wave of relief, but I didn't slow down. My legs were burning, my lungs felt like they were on fire, but I kept running until I reached the car door. I jumped in, locking the doors as soon as I was inside. The forest outside was completely dark now, as though all the light had been drained away. With shaky hands, I started the engine and threw the car into reverse without even looking properly. I just wanted to get out of there. As I backed up, I caught one last glimpse of the trail in the headlights. For a moment I thought I saw that figure again, standing among the trees, watching me. But I didn't stay to confirm. I drove off as fast as the car could go. I drove for nearly an hour without stopping, just trying to put as much distance as I could between me and that place. Even inside the car, with the doors locked and the headlights lighting the road ahead, I couldn't feel safe. Every so often, I glanced at the rearview mirror, expecting to see something chasing me, but the road behind stayed empty. My mind was racing. I tried to think rationally, but the handprints, the footsteps, and that thing on top of the tower, there was no explanation that wasn't terrifying. When I finally reached a small town, I pulled into a gas station and just sat there in the car, trying to calm down. I thought about calling the police, but what would I say? That I was being followed by something I couldn't even understand? I ended up just sitting there, staring at the forest in the distance, trying to convince myself that I was safe. To this day, I still don't know what happened that night. I've never gone back to that tower or the Appalachian Trail. And no matter how much I try to forget, sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night with the feeling that I'm still being watched. Maybe it's paranoia, but sometimes I swear I hear those whispers again, as if the wind is calling my name.